Hello and welcome to the Andrew Ferris podcast. Thanks so much for joining me for another episode of the show. Today on the show, I have my great friend, second-time guest on the Andrew Ferris podcast, Panagiota Hatzis, who is the founder, the CEO of Kati Kalo Consulting. And Panagiota is awesome, and she's the best. And that's why I brought her on a second time, essentially, because she's great. And not just because she's great, but because she did work for me. So I talked to her last time about scaling the internal operations of a business and what does it take to do that in so many words. And then we hung up and I thought, wait a minute, I'm adding an employee and potentially some contractors and maybe going to actually start doing a thing that I didn't think I was going to do, which is to build out a team and build out systems and processes and all those things. And so I thought I need Panagiota to help me with that right after we talked about her helping other people with that. So that's what we did. And on this episode, what we're going to do is talk about exactly what she did for me and why I think it was some of the best money I have spent so far as a founder of a consulting business in the, running for about a year and a half now. I worked with Panagiota for about a month to build out my internal systems and processes so that as I start to think about adding team members and those sorts of things, I'm well set up for it. And what we're going to do on this episode is talk about why and how and what. And I'll try anywhere we can to point you to any actual things that she did for me. So I think you're going to like this a lot. If you were interested in hearing from her last time, then you will definitely like this episode because it will give you a sense of, I think, what excellence looks like on beginning to build out the foundation of your operations as you scale. Let's not delay it. Let's get in. Panagiota, thanks for coming back. How you doing?
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me again. Very excited to be here. It was such a joy and such a pleasure to get to work with you on establishing a foundation for AJF Growth.
Thank you. The pleasure was all mine. It really was. It was a delight, actually, because you and I are doing work along the way, but then also we're pretty good friends. So there's lots of giggle slacks and such being sent. So it was really fun. Also, probably worth noting here that my podcast is on YouTube. I've got my background is different than usual today because my kids are awake and loud, and so I'm marooned into the guest room having this conversation with you. And anyway, if you hear any noise in the background, that's why. I apologize in advance for being interrupted by a potential 3-year-old at some point. So, yeah. Okay, so let's just remind people who you are. You started Kati Kalo Consulting, and that's coming from a long background of working with brands, helping them scale the internal sort of down and in processes. And we'll talk about that phrase more in a second. But you had been the VP of Differentiation at Common Thread Collective. Do you want to say anything else about sort of what Kati Kalo is and where your super expertise is? Just as a reminder, you have been on the show before, and we will link the show notes. You should go listen to that. You'll get a lot more of a sense of sort of theoretically how Panagiota is thinking about things. But do you want to give people a quick reminder on any of that stuff?
Yeah, essentially what it boils down to is I help you make work life better, primarily for you. And then as a result, it's for your people too, because the more that you're enjoying work, the more the people around you are also going to be enjoying work. That's it in a nutshell. And Kati Kalo means something good in Greek. And the idea is let's build something good together. It's all through organizational effectiveness. So people operations, culture, process, all of the things that you really consider when you are thinking about the legacy that you want to create in the business that you are giving out to the world.
Yeah, so super helpful. So, we talked about this phrase immediately here of going down and in versus out and up for companies. And that's a phrase I've heard you use in various settings before. I don't know if it was original to you or if it was Taylor Holiday who first said it and has stuck or what, but I know it came up in conversation between the two of you and how you think about things when you were working at CTC. What do you mean by that? Just, again, give people a sense of kind of how you're thinking about that and your role within that.
I will give credit to Taylor because that is where it really did come into full actualization because he is such a thoughtful thought leader for going up and out. And I was then able to initially consider what it meant to go down and in. And when I consider down and in, because it can seem kind of ethereal, I consider almost Murphy's Law and what I can do from a people and people operations standpoint to solve for that in advance. Because I promise you, things are not going to go according to what you have in your mind, especially when other people are involved. And if I take it one level lower, ultimately going down and in is considering how do I want to take care of people? How am I creating a place that I actually want to show up to? Because as sexy as the thing is that you're building for Up and Out and the impact that you're making in the world, if people don't want to come to work and help you build that thing or help you sell that thing, ultimately, what are you even doing? And so if you're considering what it means to take care of your people, to show up to a place and create an atmosphere, a culture that people want to show up to, that's what it means to go down and in. How do you actually operationalize that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So that kind of thinking is something that I wouldn't have probably thought of in the sort of earliest stage of a business if I was running an e-com business and I was like where I am. It's like single, like just adding my first team members. But because I actually run a service business, I sort of immediately realized something, which is that the moment that I brought in even one other person, there's now like all of these things to get the work done and delivered to a client at the end of the day that I am going to be bad at. And that like, and I mean me specifically. And I think it's probably true for a lot of people who are sort of like oriented in entrepreneur types who are thinking about building people building these businesses. It's just typically not the kind of person who is first and foremost a process person. And that can be a lie. We tell ourselves that sort of like, oh, I'm just bad at process. And so that can be unhelpful in one respect. But I also think there's a natural thing here where some people just like wake up knowing that they love building systems and processes and sort of handling the detail orientation of that. For me, as you have experienced many times in our shared working life, like handling the details of systems, it feels like trying to go sprinting through the mud to me. It's like it just feels so difficult. So that doesn't mean it doesn't need to be done though. It does need to be done. It's really important. And so having somebody who can sort of clear up that mud for me and help me accomplish that thing better is like a really crucial thing. And so I brought on one person, and just immediately started thinking about all of these issues. So the person is fully remote, starting part-time, did some contractor work for me before, and I was trying to sort out whether or not I wanted her to be a contractor or an employee. She's going to move from one state to another pretty soon. And so I had to figure out how any legal things related to contractors and employees vary from state to state. Also, I'm in California. My business is not registered in Delaware, which is probably a mistake, but that's what it is. And so California has specific laws around contractors and employees. And so that was an issue to think about. So there's this whole bucket in the beginning of this. As I brought in literally one person, there's this whole bucket of things, which is like legal and like sort of what I would call like HR liability concerns for me just wanting to stay above board, and also recognizing that like a lot of those laws are put into place to protect employees. And I want to protect employees too. I want my business to be a place where that is good. And so like following the spirit of that matters to me. So if that's the way that this has gone, then aside from the sort of like pure legal and financial liability, that's fine with me. I want to make sure that I treat people well as I grow. And I think a lot of people relate to that. They build businesses, they're proud of it, they're excited to get people sharing it, and they want to treat them well. So that's most of the entrepreneurs I'm around. So, okay. So one of the first things that you and I did, maybe if you want, actually, it might help if you describe sort of the product that you delivered to me a little bit to sort of clarify this down and in kind of concept. But then we can sort of walk through, I think, some of the things that you ended up doing for me, because I am so bad at it, and it would be very helpful to hear you sort of think to unpack how you dealt with it a little bit. So yeah, start with the product.
Okay, and before I actually start with the product, I just want to commend you because you are one hire in and you did take this seriously enough to consider, what do I need to put in place now to not only protect myself, but ultimately, we'll talk about this, some of the policies that you crafted that you wanted to have in place are things that are going to attract more people if AJF Growth grows, right? And so I commend you on that, because it is so easy to say, it's just one person. I have a great relationship with them. I'm hiring my best friend. We've done this in the past. Like all of those things are bells and whistles that aren't necessary right now. But ultimately, I believe in order to keep those relationships intact, you do this from the outset, and that way the expectations are set like from the outset going forward. So
really fast, Panagiota, really fast. Actually, I want to say something about that. This is actually a represents a development in my own thinking about this kind of thing, what you just put your finger on. So my first employee is my sister-in-law. And I used to sort of be annoyed at like contract making and detail things like this, because I felt like, gosh, come on, we'll be fine. But what I have really come to realize is that like good, clear expectations, including good, clear contracts, are an incredible gift to everybody in an organization, because what they do is they make it so that nobody is working off their assumptions. Everything is written down as clearly as possible, and then there's not no judgment calls. There's less judgment calls, and that also creates less room for people to feel like they were treated unfairly. And because I value this relationship a lot, it's my sister-in-law, like I said, it's actually my wife's sister, and because of that, like who's her best friend, so because of that, it's really important to me that that she knows what she's signing up for. She's got clarity about that before we add anybody else to say anything, and she does trust me and all those things, but like that she doesn't feel like there's any way in which she's going to get screwed in this. And so like by saying, here's where it's written down, here's what the policy is, here's why we did it that way, it just makes it so that like it sort of smooths everything out so that you can actually focus on the work itself and keep the relationship good, as opposed to having to focus on like the lines of communication and those sorts of things, which is what you want. You want to be able to great contract making and great systems like this. What they do is they make it so that you can focus on the work and instead of get distracted. So anyway, I used to think about that really differently, but I've now come to really, really, really value that.
I appreciate you bringing that up because even after our work and establishing all of these, you've slacked me a couple of times and said, hey, where do we have this written down? And I was able to say, it's exactly right here. These are the things that we referenced. And you're like, oh, that's right. These are the things that I'm reinforcing. So not only does it create a clear line, but it's also a reference point for a point of transparency and consistency. So you're ultimately creating the legacy again in the leadership style that you are wanting other people to also model and mimic with your customers, with your clients, and with other people that you're ultimately going to continue to hire within your organization, right? And so if you're not modeling that from the top down, why would you expect it from anybody else?
Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah, I think that's totally right. Yeah, and it has been so great to have that written down. It's like, oh, that's a solved problem. How much do I reimburse her for the internet? That's a solved problem. We discussed it, talked about it. It's now written in a policy somewhere. She can reference it. She knows I'm not just like making it up and all those kinds of things. So yeah, okay. So sorry, that's a distraction, but let's come back to this question that I asked earlier, because I think it'd be helpful for people to get a sense of, can you just talk through sort of like what that down and in product, so to speak, right? I mean, it's not quite a product, but what is it that you sort of delivered to me? What did we work on for the month? You want to describe the ins and outs of that?
Yeah, so Kati Kalo Consulting ultimately has 3 different buckets of work that I offer. One is audits/build. And what we did was essentially build your entire HR people operations department. We ended up walking away with a few different deliverables. One was essentially a lot of different documents. 2 was process templates, and 3 was an actual onboarding process for your new hires. Documents included a handbook. You choose to use Gusto as your payroll provider. And I have to say, I used Gusto back in the day and it wasn't my favorite. And oh my gosh, have they evolved? It has been a tremendous partnership with them, getting to see the bells and whistles that they have embedded within their platform. And so we were able to not only build your handbook, but then we were able to also build out the thoughtful California processes. And policies. I am not an expert on Illinois. That's where your first hire is. And Gusto was able to populate all of those. And then we were able to tweak and make those reflective of what you wanted for AJFG. So we did that. We did contractor compliance. How do I know that this is okay to hire this person as a contractor versus an employee? What are the things that I need to take into consideration? Then we also did your contractor contract. Then we did your scope of system use, which is my SOSU, as I like to call it. And we talked about potentially going into a little bit more detail there because it talks about what each system is, when to use it, and then how to use it. Specifically breaking down the async versus the synchronous communication that you're doing with all of these different tools and when you're actually going to call attention to them. So if you wanted to bring up your system of scope use, your SOSU for AJFG.
All right, let me pull that up so people can see what you're talking about here. This is a really, really cool deliverable that came in this process, because everybody has the problem. So I would call this under the bucket of like how we work well, and specifically to setting up somebody when they are added to the team, whether an employee or a contractor, really, to like figure out how they get integrated into the actual workflow in a way that makes it so that your work happens in a really good way. So I will show you this. It's funny, you call it the SOSU. In my mind, it's been the SOSU the whole time in my
The
mind.
SOSU.
So anyway, the SOSU. Yeah.
That's cute.
Yeah. All right. I'm glad you think so. Okay, so let me pull up the scope of system use here. All right, so we can see how this works. So you had asked me a bunch of different stuff, sort of like what tech we are and aren't using, and how we wanted to sort of integrate all of those things. This was sort of like an interview process / conversation. And so, can you see my screen, Panagiota?
I can, yeah. And the purpose behind that is I've recently spoken about
See,
this
SOSU.
on.
See, look at that. That clearly
So
says SOSU.
I think of it of like SOS sort of video, you know. But
I think
yes,
I think SOSU is going to take off. Yeah, it's going to be a term, and nobody's going to know it came from you, but it came from you.
that's fine. I'll give you credit. You can coin it.
That's right.
The main driver behind doing something like this is one, we talked about it in our other pod. GitLab has published their entire handbook down to how they use each system. And I recently published something on LinkedIn that talks about how your margins reflect the use of your tech stack and or tool stack, right? So if you're investing in all of these different tools, Zoom, Slack, Asana, Loom, all of these different things that you're paying for monthly, and sure, maybe it's just 2 people for now, but consider that across 125 people. If they don't know how to use them, what's the point of even having the systems or the tech or the tools in place, right? It has a considerable impact on your margins because then you're not even doing any quality control. You don't know how people, you think they're engaging with your clients and your customers in a certain way, but you don't actually know.
This is a genius insight that you had, actually, and I think it clearly comes from you working at CTC. This is my guess, and being on the ground floor from like team in an office with like a dozen of us or whatever back in those days, maybe 20. I don't remember how many were there when you came, but something like that, up to scaling up to like 120 or whatever it got to, fully remote. And I think, like, I'm sure one of the things you watched happen there and then tried to sort out was how that team like used and did not use technology, which is the way. I mean, it's the way any team functions, is the systems, the tech stack internally, but especially if you're fully remote, like, it just matters so much. And as you started pointing these things out to me, I was like, oh my gosh, you're completely right. There's all of these things that are obvious to me that we should be using, but that actually, like, I need to make it clear that when somebody else joins, they need to know where to look for things and what to use and how to communicate, because there's actually like 75 communication tools. I mean, it's just like, there's so many different ways to do different things, right? You just think like there's Slack, there's texting, there's phone calls, there's Zoom, there's Loom, there's email, and there's Asana. That's off the top of my head. There's 7 different ways somebody could contact me for something. Which one do I reach out to you with? If I have a comment to you, a question about work, which one? Well, knowing the answer to that question and then also using actually not only knowing it, but, and I think this is something you're helpful with, is actually picking the right one, like committing to this is what this one is good for and this one is not, and sort of giving some guidance on that is like such an incredible time saver and like work smoother, So that notion that margin, especially for a remote service business, that margin is protected by having a great adoption of your SOSU is so important. And so, yeah, so we've got here, I don't know, do you want to go through this, Panagiota? What's the best way to attack it?
I think that we could actually probably concentrate on Slack because it's one that
Asana
is
and
top
Slack.
of mind
I agree.
for everyone.
Yeah. So let's see, we've got Slack. Okay, yeah. So here's my Slack portion. But yeah, so do you want to talk through sort of how we decided together to use Slack?
Yeah, it was a lot of back and forth conversation, and I think that ultimately what led to us building the thing that we did specifically on Slack was, Andrew, how do I get a hold of you if I have something that is incredibly urgent? Is it Slack? Is it email? Or is it text message? Because Slack is the default for so many organizations, and it's also the thing that often gets in the way. Well, did you check Slack? Well, I don't know. I thought I was supposed to check this, or I thought I was supposed to check this, or it got lost because there's so much activity on Slack. And so as a result, if you establish from the outset, like, hey, this is where you're going to go to, then you're solving for a lot of unwanted issues in the long run. And so you even see here, it's the third bullet point down on when to use, underline, phone calls are key for urgent communication. Okay, that's great. So I know that if there's something urgent going on, don't Slack you. I should call you, you
Because
know?
we have clarified here too, don't expect an immediate response when you Slack. And that's like really important to me because everybody knows that like Slack becomes this like dictator of your time. And it is tyrannical. It's like somebody Slacks you and they expect you to respond right away. And that's like could not be worse for getting deep work done. So, and then of course things get lost there all the time too. So it's like, look, if a client is beating down the door and needs something fast and you have a fire, don't Slack. Like pick up the phone and call me. And my phone number is in my Slack profile, so somebody knows where it is. But yeah, like having that clarified alone is so useful. And then even like message scheduling, we clarified here. We make liberal use of Slack's message scheduling feature because again, remote teams, different time zones. If I know my sister-in-law who's in Illinois, she's moving to Virginia or to Maryland, she's going to be 2 to 3 hours ahead of me in California. I don't want to Slack her at 4 o'clock while she's eating dinner and expect her to like pick up her phone and look. And in fact, what's probably better is for me to like schedule that Slack for the next day so that even though we say here, you don't have to respond right away, it just also reduces the pressure of responding right away anyway. So instead, it's like schedule the message for the next morning as a way to reinforce that basic idea.
And, it's also, again, under the asynchronous, it says don't take offense also in case you don't end up using the scheduling function to early or late messages because it's so mundane. And I get that some people might feel like, oh, this is so boring. I can't believe that we're talking about scheduling Slack messages. This is where your culture is built. This is where that's being reinforced. If I'm a single mom and I have a newborn at home, or I'm a dad because my wife is working and I need to go and run and do something with the kids or pick them up or what have you, and I'm off for a certain amount of hours during the day that might be considered quote unquote normal working hours, but then I'm slacking you late, that's actually balance for me. I'm not creating like a toxic environment by slacking you late at night. I got the break in the middle of the day to do the thing that I need to do for my kids or run an errand for my mom, or I don't know, something happens at the house, like whatever that thing might be, you're actually giving permission for people to create the balance in their life that they seek to create, that they really genuinely want from a job. And you're saying, so long as your work is getting done, that's all that matters. I'm not trying to give you added pressure. Like, respond to me within a reasonable time. Like, these are all of the parameters to set you up for success, not keep you from success.
Yeah, I don't think it's a remotely small thing. Like, I think it's like one of the main things that happens for remote teams in workplaces that affects their life, like, and that affects like their satisfaction in their job. Like, it just matters so much. You had this other genius idea. I like loved this. This is another thing I thought like reflected your sort of clear expertise in thinking about and having experiences. I think about this a lot when I'm working with like, I think my sweet spot for clients is like taking an entrepreneur who's in the low 7 figures of revenue and getting them to like 20 plus, basically, right? Like that journey from low 7 figures in revenue to 20-ish. And we can go beyond that too, but it just depends on the business, all those things. But like somewhere in that range, I have walked that road with a lot of businesses. I know what the landmines are going to be. And so I think part of the reason I'm able to help those clients effectively is because I've just done it. I've just done it a lot of times, so I know where the landmines are. I feel really confident doing that. I had this experience with you with this where it was like, oh, you know exactly where the landmines are here. Because you had this brilliant idea, which was for the first 2 weeks of a new employee starting, do not give them access to Slack. Make it so that they have to live in Asana. And so this brings up another element of the Slack frustration that people have to where the tool becomes tyrannical because work happens in Slack, which means work gets lost in Slack. It is a terrible way to collaborate on ongoing projects. It sucks. And I had actually already invited my sister-in-law into Slack. So it was like kind of too late for me to do this, but I will for sure in the future do things this way again, do things this way where your advice will be followed because I use Asana. You'd recommend it. I think you like to ClickUp more, but that's okay. I mean, basically having a good project management software. And if I was starting from scratch, by the way, I totally would have followed your advice there just because if I hadn't already built everything out, just because you know better than I do. But in any case, I have Asana for my project management software. I was already using it, even if it was just me, liberally. And so it was really comfortable for me. And so when I invited my sister-in-law in, one of the things you pushed me on right away was like, get all of your work possibly as much as you possibly can, including all communication about that work in Asana, use your inbox, have Asana integrated into your Slack so that work happens there. And so that even if you're in Slack, it sort of nudges you to move back into Asana. And then, like I said, that idea is so genius to say, like, actually, one way to avoid Slack creep, basically, is to make it so that the person from day one does all of their working and communicating in Asana. So that every comment, every message, everything happens there. So they will like sort of drill those grooves down into their work life, and then they will go along those grooves from there. So anyway, I just thought that was brilliant. Anything else you want to say about that, or about sort of the Asana Slack work collaboration challenge?
Yeah, I think that we as humans are creatures of habit and creatures of comfort. And Slack, it has the least amount of resistance in terms of user face and user experience, which is why so many of us default towards it. So I get it. And it's also the reason that so many people now are feeling overwhelmed because they don't know where something is stored when. There's communication overload. Did you mention that in Asana, or is that actually in Slack? Or where did you do it in a comment in a Word doc that we're working off of? And so the limitation of prohibiting people from being in Slack for 2 weeks can seem super jarring and really off-putting. And honestly, it should be. The idea is then, how do you build out the systems that you're really trying to reinforce? And we created an actual like personal board for onboarding within Asana for your new hires, so that initial communication with that person, you're not going to not communicate with them. You have to communicate with them. It's just all going to take place in Asana in a really thoughtful way relative to each project. And we created a way to reinforce that. The other part is then, well, how do you welcome people? How do you make them feel like they're a part of the team on the first day if they're not in Slack? There's ways around that, right? And so if you're open to doing things differently, which I know all of your listeners are, otherwise they wouldn't be listening to you, then just kind of consider, what does it mean to go against the grain and build something in a really innovative way? Because people and process and all of that fun stuff can be really fun too. And it's actually my favorite Slack memory with you. I had finished building something. It might have been for onboarding. I was like, Andrew, are you so excited this is done? And your response was, let's put it this way. I'm excited that you're excited. I was like, yeah.
It's really true. Really true, because like I if you're excited about it, it means it's probably good for my business in terms of the ability to do these things internally. So that makes me excited. You're excited, like your excitement's like a leading indicator, that I should be excited because it's probably helping. So yeah, that's right. Yeah, that personal board thing is genius. Let's actually move over to that kind of question, because there's so we talked a little bit about how you had sort of set me up for success with all of the documentation around contractor versus employee and state by state and all those things. So that was like, for me, you're not a lawyer, but so there's that. But you are an HR professional in a way that means that there's like this element of this kind of thing that's really helpful. And I remember getting the advice a long time ago that like one of the places you should not skip ever, and like where you should be willing to pay more, is almost anything that touches like legal and liability issues. You'll just end up paying for it down the road, and probably more if you don't handle those things with excellence. So having you just sort of guide me through the process without me having to go research all of this stuff about like how to navigate what is acceptable where and when around some of those distinct things. And then actually aided by Gusto was very helpful too. Gusto was a really useful tool for kind of knocking those dominoes down for me. All right, so this is absolutely the perfect episode for me to talk to you about my friends at More Staffing. More Staffing is a talent agency that helps you recruit, onboard, train, integrate incredible e-commerce talent from the Philippines into your business. And at this point, you've heard me talk about More Staffing before. Probably I love what they are doing, and you understand the value proposition. As they say, virtual assistants can be useful in your business. Virtual professionals in the Philippines can be transformative. That's because More Staffing is going to connect you to incredible employees, high integrity, high work ethic, high knowledge, and those people are going to come in and be much less expensive than hiring those same folks in the US or wherever you are. That sounds great, but there is a point of friction that a lot of business owners struggle with as they think about doing that, which is, how do you make sure that you can actually build the systems and have the setup so that those folks can actually thrive and succeed in their work? Isn't it going to be hard to manage them if they're on different time zones and all those things? Well, if you're listening to this episode with me talking to Panagiota, this is the perfect time to be thinking about this, because as you build out your internal processes and systems and make sure that your tech stack is set up and all those things, you are going to set yourself up to succeed and to thrive as you integrate talent from across the world. And so these two should come together perfectly. Do the things that are needed so that you can build up your foundation that I'm talking about with Panagiota in this very episode, And at the same time, go work with more staffing who's going to come right in and work right in within that system that you're building and help you connect to the very best talent that you can possibly find. If you want to look into hiring incredible e-commerce talent from the Philippines, go to morenow.co. That's morenow.co. They will hold your hand through the entire process, and I love what they are doing. I think they're a huge help to your growing e-commerce business. So one more time, it's morenow.co. Tell them I sent you, and go get the best value you can as you scale your business. Having that stuff really clear was like incredibly helpful. So there's sort of like this liability thing that's like all part of this work, and it is part of what like HR professionals do, right? They help you think through those kinds of things. And then there's this like, how you use your tech stack, which is this margin protector. And I think getting clarity around that for an organization is massive. But I want to talk about something else that you mentioned now, which is sort of this next phase of this, which is this onboarding kind of element. So you have thought carefully about this. And I know we talked about this on our last episode. And if you are interested in this part of the conversation, you should go back and listen to that, because actually it caught my attention when we talked last time that you talked about onboarding as part of how you do a great job with retention and making sure that experience is good so that people are set up for success and they stick around. So let's sort of talk through what you delivered to me from an onboarding perspective to make it so that this first employee, but then future employees would be set up for success and move through things well. And just tell me anywhere you want me to screen share and I'll pull it up.
Great. Yeah. So I know that there's plenty of studies out there that actually link a onboarding process to your retention up to 70%. They say that 70% of turnover can actually be attributed to a poor onboarding experience. And so when you think about that, what does it actually mean for you to bring somebody into AJFG or whatever your organization is? And I consider onboarding in two phases. One is onboarding to the organization, and then the second part is onboarding to your actual role. And we talked about not expecting a return on investment within at least the first 30 days. So going back to employees not having access to Slack for the first 2 weeks, well, what if I need them to do something? One, you can use Asana or whatever your PMS is in a really thoughtful way. And two, they shouldn't be in front of your LTV client within their first 2 weeks, ideally, right? And there's so much of like, well, I just need them to get in and I need them to start doing the thing. I need them to start creating impact. If you don't set them up for success, you are setting them up for failure and you are setting yourself up for frustration. So we took that and we worked backwards. So we considered, what does onboarding look like on the back end? So for you, because you are the end all be all CEO doing all of the things, you're like, can you make it as specific as possible? What do I need to do from like setting up tech, buying tech, all of that stuff? And how do I actually use Gusto from an onboarding perspective? You've got the payroll side down pat, but what about the other parts? So you and I worked together where I created templates, I created processes, I created them as an actual list in Asana, broken down by different overall deliverables that you're going to need to do for like their first day. And then I also filmed looms for you in your loom library so that you can easily reference back and say, oh, that's exactly where I go. This is what she means by that. So we did the onboarding by new hire for their first day paperwork process. We did a welcome deck. And that's basically an introduction to AJF Growth, and that will continue to grow and evolve. But it was a conversation between you and I and things that are very central to who you are and how you see your organization growing. And although we haven't finalized what your values and your mission statement are, like there's bits and pieces of that are reinforced just through like the TED Talks that you offered. And so when you onboard people to things that are important to you, they then know that those things are important to you and they start to act in that way. Hopefully, if you made the right hire, right? And then the biggest piece of it is reinforcing the SOSU, the SOSU, and what it means to really like create a very intentional tech onboarding process. If you actually bring that up, I think in the personal board template that we've created, we can go through, I think at a high level, what some of those tasks are. Asana, for example, is something that, you get onboarded to, and we have a number of different videos that people need to watch, as well as like actual tasks that they get to go through. Yeah.
Yeah. So in Asana, you see the personal board here, new hire. What I would do is if I've got a new employee, I would duplicate this and then put the new hire's name in here. And then it would have all of this stuff set up. And then you could see, let me pull up this, you can see this. Yeah.
So like even the first thing there is downloading Google Chrome, right? As a like department of one that's doing everything. I can't tell you how many people that I've talked to where they're like, oh, I'm having issue because they would use Google Meet. I'm having issue with Google Meet. I'm like, well, do you have Google Chrome downloaded to your computer? And they're like, no. I was like, okay, well, of course you're going to have issues if you're using a Safari search tool for a Google Meet tool, right? So it's downloading things and then making it a default and bookmarking it. It's like that little minutia that ultimately has the biggest impact on your satisfaction long term, because I am an advocate. Like, I cannot speak to this enough. Culture will not solve for broken process. People will leave if they continue to have broken process. And if you're making their job harder than it needs to be, it doesn't matter if you're giving them a $50 gift card or throwing a pizza party or whatever it is that it might be. Like, if their work is harder than it needs to be, people are going to leave.
Yeah. It's really easy to forget this, that like, I think when I was younger in these settings, like, and I watched this happen with kind of multiple organizations I've been in, like there's this sense that when people think about the word culture, what they mean, what's often in their minds is like these sort of like, office parties and like a sort of attitude at work. And that's nice. Like that has meant that places I've worked have been generally like positive environments, which is good. I think, they're not stuffy. I like that. Those things do matter. But it's easy to forget that like the actual main thing I think that makes people like their jobs is when they have less friction in their jobs to do the actual work itself, and that they're proud of the work that's delivered and the work is meaningful. So like it's about the work. Like the work itself is the defining feature of what makes people like the job, as long as there's no like massive outlier. And I mean, you've probably thought harder about this than I have, Panagiota, so tell me if you think I'm wrong about any of this. But aside from sort of the outlier of a boss who screams at them every day, like it's like if you don't have any crazy thing like that, like simply being able to know how to do and to do the work like with as little friction as possible, and then to deliver that in a way that is like makes you feel proud, like that is the actual fundamental thing about a work culture that makes it a great place to work. And then everything else is sort of secondary to that in my experience. And so like having smoothness around something like make sure you're on Chrome so your calendar invites aren't messed up with which, video chat software you're using every day is like, it seems so small, but it's like, gosh, if every employee you have, like if like half of them come on, which is about Google Chrome's penetration right now, half of people use it, like half of them who come on, like don't have this thing set up. It seems so small, but like there's going to be 10 things like that on your list, and they're all going to make life harder if you don't get them right. And so just so we're clear too, I didn't touch this. Like I hired you, and you asked me some questions about like what you want to do, right? But then you built all of this so that now when a new employee comes on, they have a step-by-step in Asana process, which also teaches them how to use Asana by doing it if they've never used it before. Step-by-step Asana process to where they can go through, set their signature, and then there's a guide for like what the signature should say, and all of these things that are like, somebody comes on who's new is going to need to know how to do all that, and it's all set and it's built, and I didn't have to worry about it. And there's things to watch and things to learn, etc.
And you're exactly right. It reinforces the main system that you are building everything else off of, right? Which for us is Asana. And so when you look at Asana, it's okay, well, log into your account from your Gmail invite because they should not have created their Asana account prior to having started. So that should be done with you. Then they're going to watch some videos. And then OYO is on your own. And then we have on here calendar blocks. So you're also reinforcing, I'm actually going to have to set aside 45 minutes on my calendar to execute against something that Andrew is expecting of me. So you're also reinforcing the behaviors that you really want people to start to carry more on their own.
Yeah, and my mentality about this is that if I do this from day one with my first employee, it will be a million times easier than having it start with employee number 10 and then having to convince the first 9 to start changing all their habits. And so for me, at least, it was like, I'm just going to do this now. I'm going to need to do it at some point. I might as well do it now. It's only going to get, my time's only going to get more filled up in terms of my ability to sort of like work with Panagiota for a month on this. And so, so it was like, okay, let's just make sure all the stuff is knocked out and as good as possible. And then that way we can kind of move forward. And I don't actually know how much I'm going to scale my organization. I really don't know. But I know that if I want to start growing it more, like I feel like I'm so set up for this. What I told you about this was like, I actually wasn't sure if this was a good use of money for me at first, but I was like, I'm going to need to do some of this. There's some of these questions I don't want to go deal with. I don't want to go research somebody else and not know if I trust them or not. So like, you quoted me a price, you quoted me a good price for like what your services were because we're friends, and that's nice. Thank you. But I was going to say yes pretty much to whatever you told me, just because like that, it's just how it is. And I was like so happy I did it afterwards. I was so happy. I don't make any referral money for this podcast, by the way. Like if you go hire Panagiota now, she doesn't owe me a kickback or anything like that. But I told her, like, we got to record a podcast about this so we can show other people this because it's going to be so useful to them. Obviously, you should go work with Panagiota yourself. But like, it's just getting this kind of thing set up is going to be so useful to them. And if you don't have the internal resources, you absolutely should hire Panagiota to do it. So yeah.
I appreciate that so much. And this truly brings me so much joy.
I know,
It
that's
really,
the
really
crazy
does.
part about it.
I know. Crazy part for you. Yes, I know.
Yeah.
And I think that when, going back to what does going down and in mean, what does creating a solid foundation mean for a founder? It really is being able to free up the space for you to do the other things that you want, because now you know that this is taken care of. And there are countless conversations that I've had where you see this all the time, even on LinkedIn. Why won't they just do their jobs? I'm not asking a lot from them, right? Whoever your employee is. Well, ultimately, it comes down to expectation setting. And if you're not doing that on day one in onboarding, and the person doesn't know what you're asking of them, they don't know how to use the tools that will help them get the job done, and there's no level of reinforcement for doing any of the things that you showed them, then is that really the person's issue or is that a leadership issue, right? And so you have to take into consideration, what does it really mean to set people up for success? And ultimately, what you're doing is establishing trust. You're then giving yourself the freedom to do the thing that you want to do because you trust that you've shown people and you've given them the expectations of what it means to be successful. One of my favorite coaching and leadership ideologies comes from Brené Brown, which there's not going to be a pod that I don't quote her.
Yeah, 50% of your sayings are from Brené Brown. Yeah.
Exactly. Is being able to say, what does done look like? Because you have an idea in your head, and especially the visionaries, you are on, like mountain 3, 4, but a brand new hire is just starting. They don't know how to get that far ahead yet. So tell them what done looks like today. And if you don't know what done looks like specifically, give some parameters. I know that I want to be able to use this across 3 different states. I know I want to use this across all of my clients. I want to make it a standardized pitch deck. Whatever those things are, like, just give the rough parameters of what done looks like, but don't consider that you want something done in the color blue. Don't tell them that. And then they show up with orange and you're like, this isn't what I wanted. Whose fault is that?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. It's so easy as a leader to like blame people in your organization, but very often these things ladder up to the leader themselves. Yeah, that's super interesting. Okay, I want to actually just highlight 2 more cool things you made me really fast, and then we're low on time. So if there's anything else you want to add, kind of related to the issues of onboarding and scaling and some of those things. So I'm going to share my screen one more time here. And the first of these is the new hire. You referenced this earlier. It's another part of the onboarding process. You've got this welcome deck that is in that sort of onboarding process in Asana, but it's really cool. Like basically the idea here is there's a presentation and some time for a new hire to go through that's just got like all these different elements. Like here's this always feels awkward. It's about me. So there you go. And then obviously I haven't added this in yet because I haven't needed to do this because I had actually already hired my first hire and blah, blah, blah. But anyway, this would for sure be something that would go into place. So who is the organization, what we believe, etc. And the first of these is facts matter. And you got that from a lot of my work as a service provider is actually to teach people things. So I'm not just doing the work, but I'm also trying to help them understand why we're doing the work that we're doing. I think it's a really important part of great service business. You're actually great at this too, Panagiota. You're constantly telling me here's why we're doing things this way. And so I have this TED Talk and illustrating this idea of like facts matter. And so does teaching them well. And it's Hans Rosling talking about how much better the world's getting. Amazing TED Talk. Go watch it. It's great. But yeah, it goes through and it explains the value. And then there's an exercise related to it, etc. People matter. And on it goes, right? So a quote from C.S. Lewis that I really love. And this deck is so helpful because it gives people a sense from day one, especially when it's somebody who doesn't know me necessarily as well. Here's what I am. Here's who I am. Here's what AJF Growth is. Here's what I value, etc. So like I really love this. It's really simple and it allows there to be a standardized way that people go through all of these different elements of what it means to start in our organization and have it be good. The other thing that is really interesting that you did is actually in the interview process, sort of before the onboarding process. Interviews can famously be terrible in terms of evaluating people. There's a lot of things I like about this that you gave me, including this interview kit, sort of like, all of these things like candidate name, obviously, like just like sort of a standardized way to go through these, but then a bunch of interview questions that we worked on together, which is great. But then on the back end of that, this Google form where we can actually go through a scorecard together and try to give people a sense of what the skills actually are in each of these questions. And the reason that matters is that it actually quantifies your answer to help take some of the subjectivity out of a process that is famously subjective in the interview process, and try to at least in some way quantify what it is that you do or don't like about that candidate, and then put some numbers around that. Especially if you're going through 5 interviews for one position, you forget, your feelings change about a candidate as you go. But if you have your responses saved in real time right after an interview, now you can reference those once you have done that with candidate 1 and you get to candidate 4, and you're like, oh, okay, this is how this person compares. And maybe it's not the be all end all. You don't maybe necessarily make the decision based on like just pure number value. Go ahead and press play, right? I mean, I'm you can say whatever you want about that, but it at least gives you a sense of sort of like putting down in real time your thoughtful reaction to who that candidate is. So I just thought that was a really smart way to take a process that people are going to be terrible at in the early days of their businesses and actually bring some structure to it.
Yeah. So I'm going to touch on the welcome deck first. And the main reason that I loved building that with you was one, just posing you, giving me some of the things that have really influenced you, what is really central to you, what are things that you hope your new hires will also embody and carry with them as you all grow AJFG. And it was lovely to show then the language we believe, right? Because now when you're showing that to someone that is brand new to your organization, you're inviting them in alongside you and not just in to work for you. And there's like a mentality shift then. I get ownership in this too. These are things that I also want to adapt. But if you don't tell them from the outset, then again, you can't hold them accountable to it. If you're not reinforcing that some way, if you're not sharing that information, then again, why would anyone adapt to it? Why would anyone show up in that way?
And it's really cool to think about too. Like, I know you've talked about the concept of legacy a lot, and the notion of sort of like a business owner gets the opportunity to sort of have some of their legacy be in the business that they create. And this brought some structure to that for me. Of just sort of like, wait a minute. I mean, actually, I hadn't thought about a lot of these things when you asked me, like, what are some TED Talks that have influenced you? What about some quotes, things like that? And those very specific questions allowed me to think through, oh, what has influenced me? Why do I love this Hans Rosling TED Talk so much? I actually remember I sent this to you at CTC once. You're like, eh. And that's fine, because it just reflects that like you had asked like different people in the organization, I think, for some things that had influenced you. I think you were surfacing ideas, and it didn't, that didn't make the cut for you. And that's not a critique of anybody. It's just like, for me, it does make the cut. Why? What does that say about me and about the organization I want to create and all those things? And if this is actually going to have some legacy component, why does that make the cut? That kind of deal. And so actually being able to make it so that, wait a minute, if I do have some values I want to go through my organization, bringing clarity to those and a clear pathway to expressing those from day 1 for an employee, or day 2 or whatever day they go through the deck, is like really, really cool. I thought that was a really cool process.
Thank you. And to emphasize and reinforce what you're speaking there about legacy, it's not just what you're building and what you're doing. It's also how you're doing it. People are going to remember that the most. When you think of Steve Jobs, obviously you think of Apple and you think of innovation, but immediately next to it, you think narcissistic, toxic culture up until he came back to Apple, right? They're inexcusable from one another. They're incredibly attached. And so do you want to create the Steve Jobs before he was let go from Apple, or the Steve Jobs when he came back to Apple? Like, what's the legacy that you want to create for yourself there?
Yeah, absolutely. Did you want to touch on the interview process as well?
Yes. So what I appreciated about being able to go through the interview questions with you is we said, what are the questions and what are you ultimately trying to get at in asking this question? And what is the skill that you're ultimately trying to assess in this question? And I just don't think that people give that enough forethought whenever they're creating, if they're creating interview kits. I like showing up to interviews and the person that you're interviewing with not knowing what position you're interviewing for, or you just got out of another meeting and you're like, hold on, let me get my stuff together. I'm not sure. Okay, tell me a little bit about yourself, and you're scattered trying to do other things. Like, you're protecting against all of that, because that's ultimately like the second instance that you are impressing upon a potential new hire that you're trying to build your organization with, what they can expect from you as a leader. So trying to be like as prepared as possible for that makes life so much easier, both for the interviewer and the interviewee. So being able to say, wow, 4 of the questions that I'm asking are all related to communication. Is that something that's really critical for the position? And if so, then keep them. But what else is critical for the position? Are you asking any questions about that? Right? And if you're asking too many that are all based off of one skill set, change your questions, add some questions. Be considerate about what you're screening for and how you're screening for it, because it doesn't make any sense if Excel is critical for that person's position and you're not screening for it at all.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, one of the things I had asked you in that process too was, like, interviewing is one of those things that I know people have thought hard about, because it's like it's just been thought through and studied and considered. And I thought to myself when we were talking about this, like, oh, Panagiota has for sure thought harder about what makes for good and bad interviews than I have. So I like sent you my questions, and like I think I included in there something like, but please tell me if these are bad, because like I just know you know more about this than I do. This is one of those subjects where I'm certain you're more of an expert than I am, and so I desperately want your feedback so that we can do this well. Especially because when you realize, especially for higher leverage hires, right? Like, the person you're interviewing is very often actually interviewing you and interviewing your organization, trying to figure out if they want to work for you. And so having a sense of like how to do that well, so that you present as a good quality organization, as a good quality thinker, and all those things. So there's both sides of that. It affects them and it affects you, and affects your ability to even get that talent to come work for you, if you can sort of put your best foot forward in that conversation. Like you said, not showing up all flustered and everything.
Well, there's that flustered piece. And when you consider the top talent that you really want to attract to your organization and you put through the interview process, the best interviews that I've ever been a part of, either conducting or on the other side, I've left and I'm like, wow, that felt like a conversation. That felt like a connection more than it was, well, Andrew, tell me about yourself. My second question for you is, tell me about your biggest opportunity. Next, I'd like to ask you, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Okay. Like, that's the bare minimum. And what are you even looking for when you're asking those questions, right? And so really being able to create like transition sentences and making it more of a conversation to connect with someone, whether or not you actually end up wanting to hire them, that's the impression that they're going to leave your organization with. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, it's good. All right. Anything else that you want to hit on in this, in terms of things that you think people should hear about, that you're sort of handling and delivering and that you're passionate about in this kind of process?
Yeah, I think ultimately what we're doing when we consider doing this down and in work, when I'm doing the audits, when I'm doing the builds, is I really think that every leader and every organization is trying to make their intent and their impact become aligned. And so intent is, what is the message that I'm trying to say? What do I have in mind of how I want people to receive me? The impact is how people actually received your message. Winning is when those two things align. So your intent matches your impact, and leadership ultimately is taking responsibility when they don't. And so what are you doing on the front end to make sure that your intent and your impact are actually aligned, and you're doing the thing that you want to do in the way in which you want to do it, and people are actually receiving it that way?
That is such a helpful framework. I really, really like that a lot. Yeah, that's so interesting. I think one of the mistakes of earlier entrepreneurs is that they just assume their intent will become their impact. And it's like, cool, of course, I intended it well, And I've watched good leaders learn and adjust when they have realized that there's a distinction between those two things, and that they actually have to be more thoughtful about it, especially as the organization grows. And it becomes less relational and more about like great system smoothing some of those things out. So that's really cool. Okay, tell people where to find you. Obviously, everything that Panagiota is about to say is in the show notes, so you can just pull it up. If you're watching on YouTube, you can go check the description and go get a link there. But also, yeah, Panagiota, tell people where to find you.
You can check out the website at katikalo.co. You can check me out on LinkedIn, on my LinkedIn page, and I just freshly started a Twitter page, so Kati Kalo Co.
Still calling it a Twitter page. That's how fresh you are.
Don't hold that against me.
Go follow Kati Kalo Co on Twitter.
Kati Kalo Co on Twitter.
Okay, great. I'll make sure to link that as well, and I'll follow you immediately. Auto follow, no question. I might even add you to one of my like secret lists of people whose tweets I don't want to miss. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that, and I've already reposted 2 of your tweets, so
Really? Oh, I must have missed it. I don't know how I missed it. Yeah. I'm paying attention to those retweets. You got to keep an eye on those. Every time someone does that, you got to think about it. Yeah. All right, go do those things. Have Panagiota build out the infrastructure of your organization in the same way she has for me. And then there's another downstream positive of that, which is not only that you get the pleasure of working with Panagiota for a month, but then she's also a person who knows you and your team. And as things come up, she's a call you can make. I know, Panagiota, you also do some executive coaching, helping people sort through sort of some of the leadership issues that they face, how to have hard conversations with people, how to follow up on things. I know you take your coaching really seriously. You're giving people deliverables so that you're giving them advice, but then also here's how to make it happen. You and I have talked. We have at least one mutual friend. I don't know if she wants to be named or not, but one mutual friend who I know has used you and has spoken glowingly about the process, which is not surprising to me at all. I actually think if I was pursuing an executive coach, you would be one of the people I would first call, because the areas you're strong are the areas I feel like I would need some of the most help. And thinking specifically about really system building and teamwork and collaboration in ways where you're just going to be perceptive on things that I'm not. And so anyway, so go check that out as well. If you or somebody on your team could use some of that coaching, I would at least take a call with Panagiota and check that out. So obviously I'm a big fan. I'm talking to her a bunch here, and I mean 100% of it. So that's it. Okay, everybody has listened to this enough. Panagiota, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you so much. I'm deeply appreciative.
I know the script with my eyes closed.